They left an alien widow and her child to rot in a cage. But Glenn refuses to abandon them any longer. As meteor impacts rock the station, he unlocks the cage with a stolen override key, guiding Sierra and Leary through trembling corridors toward freedom. When security drones appear, Glenn makes the ultimate sacrifice, sending them to safety in the escape pod while surrendering himself to face the consequences alone. The shard's edge was dying. Glenn Mallory could feel it in the hollow thrum beneath his boots as he traversed the dimly lit corridor of the orbital station's eastern wing. 7 years since the official decommissioning, and yet here he was, clipboard in hand, performing his quarterly systems inspection on a ghost. The station hung in the blackness of the far rim, like a forgotten ornament. Its once gleaming hull, now pockmarked with micrometeorite scars and patches where emergency repairs had barely held during the catastrophic breach that had led to its abandonment. Most of the crew and support staff had been relocated to the newer Hesperia station. Only a skeleton maintenance team remained, tasked with the slow dismantling of the station's reusable components. Glenn was among the last, a systems inspector whose meticulous nature made him perfect for tracking the slow decay of a dying outpost. His footsteps echoed off the metal walls as he moved through the station, the sound coming back to him distorted and hollow. The lights above flickered, casting strange shadows across his path. In some sections, ice had formed in delicate crystalline patterns where environmental controls had failed completely. Glenn paused to note this on his datapad. 7 years of decommissioning, and the paperwork seemed to multiply rather than diminish. Routine maintenance, they called it. But there was nothing routine about watching something of this magnitude slowly die. The memory surfaced unbidden, his previous posting. The refugee transport where he'd discovered the ignored logs. 300 souls, their life support systems quietly malfunctioning while bureaucrats argued over jurisdiction. By the time anyone had bothered to check, it had been too late for most. Glenn had found the bodies, perfectly preserved in the cold, their faces frozen in expressions of bewilderment rather than terror. They hadn't even known they were dying. He'd filed his reports. There had been inquiries, promises of reform. But in the end, nothing had changed. The dead remained dead, and the living continued to look away. Glenn shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. His datapad chimed softly, flagging an anomaly in the data stream. He frowned, tapping through the notification. According to the automated inventory system, ration packs had been dispensed in Sector 17B 3 days ago. Impossible. Sector 17B had been cold and dead for years. The atmospheric pressure deliberately vented to preserve structural integrity after the breach. No one could survive there, and no one had access codes to requisition supplies for a ghost sector. Yet, there it was, unmistakable in the log. 4 standard ration packs, water allocation, minimal life support functionality restored to a single chamber. Glenn stared at the data, his heart beginning to pound. A system glitch? Or something worse? Either way, protocol demanded he investigate and report. He should alert his supervisor. That would be the proper procedure. File a report, wait for authorization, assemble a team. But Glenn remembered the refugees, remembered how procedure had killed them as surely as the failing life support. Instead, he adjusted his tool belt, checked the emergency oxygen tank on his hip, and set off towards Sector 17B. The journey took him through progressively more decrepit sections of the station. Environmental controls grew more erratic. The air thinned and chilled. By the time he reached the security bulkhead, separating the living sectors from the abandoned ones, his breath fogged before him in thick white clouds. The bulkhead required his credentials and biometric confirmation. For a moment, Glenn hesitated. Crossing this threshold without proper documentation and backup was a serious violation. It could cost him his job, perhaps worse. The datapad in his hand displayed the anomalous ration entry once again. 4 packs, enough to keep someone alive for days, but not much longer. Glenn pressed his palm against the scanner and watched as the massive door groaned open. Beyond lay darkness, broken only by the faint red glow of emergency lighting strips that had somehow maintained power through the years of abandonment. The cold hit him immediately, a physical wall that made his eyes water and his lungs seize. He activated his jacket's thermal function and switched on his helmet light. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a corridor choked with ice crystals and floating debris. The artificial gravity was functioning at minimal capacity here, creating a disorienting environment where small objects hung suspended in the air. Glenn moved carefully through the space, his magnetized boots keeping him anchored to the floor. According to his map, the chamber where the rations had been allocated was still a considerable distance ahead. As he progressed deeper into the abandoned sector, Glenn became aware of a sound. At first, he thought it was just the creaking of the station's superstructure, the endless expansion and contraction of metal in the extreme temperature variations of space. But there was something else, something rhythmic and faint, barely perceptible even in the tomb-like silence. A trembling sound, like a vibration or a whimper. Glenn paused, holding his breath to listen. There it was again, not mechanical, but organic, almost like crying. The sound led him away from his plotted course, down a narrow maintenance passage that wasn't on his official schematics. The passage ended in what appeared to be a hastily constructed barrier, metal panels welded together to seal off whatever lay beyond. But the welds were old and corroded, and one panel had come loose, creating a gap just large enough for Glenn to squeeze through. The sound was definitely coming from beyond. Heart pounding. Glenn slipped through the opening and found himself in a small chamber that had once been a storage room. His helmet light swept across the space, revealing walls covered in frost and a floor littered with discarded equipment. And in the center of the room, a cage. It was a crude construction, fashioned from repurposed security barriers and maintenance grating. Inside, huddled together on a thin pallet of insulation material, were two figures. Glenn's light fell upon them, and he froze in disbelief. The larger figure raised a hand to shield four large, luminous eyes from the sudden brightness. Her skin was a pale lavender color, covered in fine, iridescent scales that caught the light and reflected it in rainbow patterns. Where a human would have hair, she possessed a crown of delicate, feather-like appendages that quivered with her movement. Pressed against her was a smaller version of herself, a child. Glenn realized with a shock. The little one's scales were brighter, almost silver in color, and its feathered crest was just beginning to develop. It was from this child that the crying sound emanated, a soft, rhythmic vibration that seemed to pulse in the cold air. They were voidborn, a spacefaring species from the Cygnus arm. Glenn had encountered them before at trading posts and diplomatic functions, but never this far out on the rim, and never in such conditions. The adult's four eyes fixed on him, wide with fear but also something else, recognition. She had seen humans before. She knew what he was. Glenn stood frozen at the threshold, protocol and compassion waging war within him. Protocol dictated he report this immediately. Unauthorized alien presence on a decommissioned station was a serious security matter. There would be investigations, containment procedures, endless bureaucracy. But the child was crying, and the adult, a female, he guessed from the coloration of her crest, looked half-frozen despite the thermal properties of void-born physiology. How long had they been here? The station had been decommissioned 7 years ago. Had they been trapped all this time, forgotten in the evacuation? Or had they arrived later, seeking shelter? And who had put them in this cage? The female made a soft, clicking sound, and the child immediately fell silent, pressing closer to its mother's side. Glenn realized he was still pointing his light directly at them. Slowly, He adjusted it to illuminate the room more generally, then took a careful step forward. "I won't hurt you," he said. Knowing the universal translators that had once been standard on the station were long offline. But he hoped his tone might convey what his words could not. The female watched him warily, but didn't retreat further into the cage. Now that his eyes had adjusted to the dim light, Glenn could see she was terribly thin. Her scales dull, except when caught directly in his beam. The child, too, showed signs of malnutrition, its developing crest limp and discolored. The mystery of the ration pack solved itself in his mind. Someone else knew they were here. Someone had been keeping them alive, barely, but had also kept them imprisoned and hidden. Glenn made a decision then, one that would alter the course of his life irreversibly. He reached to his belt and unhooked his emergency rations. Not much, but better than nothing. "Food," he said, holding it out. "For you." The female made no move to take it, her eyes darting between his face and the offering. Glenn understood her hesitation. He was just another human to her, and humans had put her in this cage. Slowly, he set the ration on the floor and pushed it toward the cage with his foot. Then he backed away, giving them space. The female waited until he was several steps back before reaching a long, slender arm through the bars to snatch the package. Her movements were quick but precise, suggesting a dexterity that belied her weakened state. She tore open the packet with practiced ease, not her first encounter with human rations. Then, and broke the contents in half. The larger portion she gave to the child, who took it with trembling hands and began to eat ravenously. Glenn watched, a lump forming in his throat. The cage door had a standard security lock, nothing he couldn't bypass with his maintenance codes. He could free them right now. And then what? Where would they go? How would they survive? And what would happen to him when his superiors discovered what he'd done? The female seemed to read his thoughts. She shook her head slowly, then pointed to the ceiling where a small, blinking red light indicated an active surveillance camera. They were being watched. Glenn's blood ran cold. This wasn't just neglect or a forgotten prisoner. Someone was actively monitoring the situation. Someone with enough authority to keep this sector partially operational, despite the decommissioning. He needed time to think, to plan. But first, he needed to establish trust. Glenn pointed to himself. "Glenn," he said. The female hesitated, then pointed to herself. "Sira," she responded, her voice a melodic whisper. She touched the child's head gently. "Leary." Names, a connection. It was a start. "I'll be back," Glenn promised, hoping his intent, if not his words, would be understood. He mimed eating, then held up 2 fingers. 2 days. I'll bring more food." Sira studied him for a long moment, then dipped her head in what might have been acknowledgement. Glenn backed toward the opening he'd come through, his mind racing with questions and half-formed plans. As he slipped back into the maintenance passage, he caught one last glimpse of them, mother and child, huddled together in their cage, watching him with 4 luminous eyes that held the faintest flicker of something he hadn't seen at first. Hope. True to his word. Glenn returned 2 days later. He'd spent the intervening time carefully researching station logs, trying to piece together how a void-born woman and her child had ended up imprisoned on a decommissioned station. The official records were silent on the matter, which told him more than any documentation could have. This was deliberate, a systematic erasure of their existence. He brought more than food this time. A small portable heater, medical supplies, proper blankets, all items he'd carefully smuggled from supplies marked for disposal. Nothing that would be missed, but each potentially life-saving in the frozen conditions of Sector 17B. Glenn had also brought tools to bypass the surveillance system, at least temporarily. He couldn't risk disabling it entirely. That would trigger automatic alerts. But he could loop the feed for short periods, creating windows where he could interact with the prisoners unobserved. Sira seemed less frightened at his return, though still wary. Leary, however, watched him with undisguised curiosity from behind her mother's protective embrace. After setting up the heater and distributing the supplies, Glenn sat cross-legged on the floor near the cage. He needed to communicate more effectively if he was going to help them. Pulling out his datapad, he opened a basic drawing program and sketched a simple picture of the station, then a ship moving away from it. He pointed to the image, then to Sira questioningly. Sira studied the drawing, then slowly shook her head. She reached toward the datapad hesitantly, and Glenn handed it to her through the bars. With surprising dexterity, she modified his drawing, adding another, smaller ship approaching the station. Then she drew figures being transferred from the small ship to the station. Finally, she added bars around the figures. Glenn frowned, trying to interpret her meaning. "You were brought here? From another ship?" Sira couldn't understand his words, but she seemed to grasp his confusion. She drew another figure, clearly human from the shape, standing beside the caged figures. Then she violently scratched out the human figure, her movements so forceful they nearly cracked the datapad screen. "Someone took you prisoner," Glenn murmured. "And then they... what? Left? Died?" Sira handed the datapad back, her expression unreadable, but her crest had flattened against her skull, a sign of distress or anger. Glenn remembered from his limited knowledge of void-born physiology. Leary suddenly made a soft, musical sound and pointed to Glenn's hand. He realized he had been unconsciously tapping his fingers against the floor, a nervous habit. To his surprise, Leary began to mimic the pattern, her slender fingers tapping against the metal bars of the cage. Glenn smiled and tapped again. A different pattern this time. Leary immediately copied it, her eyes bright with concentration. An idea formed in Glenn's mind. He began tapping in a simple pattern: long, short, long, short, 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 long, short, long. The ancient Morse code signal for SOS. He repeated it several times, then pointed to himself, then to Sira and Leary. "Help," he said. "It means I want to help you." Sira watched this exchange, her head tilted in apparent understanding. After a moment, she reached out and laid her hand on top of Leary's, stopping the child's tapping. Then, she tapped out the SOS pattern herself, perfectly mimicking what Glenn had taught. A silent agreement had been formed. Over the next weeks, Glenn established a routine. Every third day, he would slip away from his regular duties to visit Sector 17B, bringing supplies and spending precious minutes with Sira and Leary while the surveillance feed looped harmlessly through empty footage. He learned more about them through their improvised communication of drawings, gestures, and tapping patterns. Sira had been a voice keeper among her people, something like a historian or a storyteller, from what Glenn could gather. She and her husband had been traveling on a cultural exchange mission when their small vessel had been intercepted by humans. The humans had not been station personnel, but smugglers using the abandoned sectors as a temporary base. They had killed Sira's husband when he'd resisted and imprisoned her and Leary, intending to sell them to collectors in the inner systems, where exotic aliens fetched high prices. But something had gone wrong. The smugglers had left suddenly. Station logs confirmed a security alert around that time that had nearly exposed the illegal operation. In their haste, they had abandoned their captives, perhaps intending to return when the danger had passed. That had been almost a year ago. Since then, Sira and Leary had survived only because a single station maintenance worker had discovered them and taken pity. He'd brought them occasional supplies, but had been too afraid to free them or report their presence. 3 months ago, he'd been transferred to another posting, leaving them with no one. Until Glenn. During his visits, he noticed Leary gradually becoming more animated, more childlike. She began to make soft, singing sounds when he appeared, and her silver scales regained some of their luster under the influence of proper nutrition and warmth. Syrah, too, began to show signs of recovery, though a deep wariness remained in her luminous eyes. She would watch Glenn interact with Leary, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and apprehension. One day, during his 6th visit, Glenn brought something special, a small pot of nutrient gel in which he had planted flower seeds from the station's abandoned hydroponics bay. He showed Leary how to care for it, miming the watering process and explaining through gestures how the plant would grow. Leary's delight was evident in the way her crest feathers vibrated with excitement. Syrah, watching, made a sound Glenn had never heard before, something like laughter, though threaded with a bitter sweetness that made his chest ache. That night, after returning to his quarters, Glenn made a decision. Bringing supplies and companionship wasn't enough. He needed to get them out. The cage, the surveillance, the deliberate erasure from official records. Someone powerful wanted Syrah and Leary to remain hidden, which meant going through official channels was out of the question. Glenn would need to act alone, in secret, and against every protocol he'd sworn to uphold. The risk was enormous. If caught, he would face charges of sabotage, theft, harboring illegal aliens, and likely treason. His career would be over. His freedom, too, possibly for decades. But the alternative, leaving them to slowly waste away in that frozen cage, was unthinkable. Glenn began planning in earnest. He would need an escape route, documentation, transportation, and he would need to disable the surveillance system permanently, without triggering alerts. Most crucially, he would need an override key for the cage's lock, not just a bypass that would register in the system logs, but a genuine key that would leave no electronic trace. Such keys were rare, possessed only by the highest-ranking security personnel. Glenn had no hope of requisitioning one legitimately, which left theft. Chief Security Officer Ramos kept her override key in her office, secured in a biometrically locked drawer. Glenn had seen it once during an emergency inspection of the security systems. Getting access to that office, bypassing the biometric lock, and stealing the key would be nearly impossible. Nearly, but not entirely. A system-wide maintenance check was scheduled for the following week, a standard procedure where all non-essential systems would be temporarily powered down and rebooted to clear accumulated errors. During that brief window, security protocols would default to mechanical backups. It was a small window, 15 minutes at most, but it might be enough. Glenn spent the days leading up to the maintenance check meticulously preparing. He created false documentation for 2 refugees allegedly rescued from a damaged transport, requisitioned emergency rations under the guise of restocking inspection kits, and identified a rarely used maintenance tunnel that led directly to an emergency evacuation pod bay. He visited Syrah and Leary once more before the scheduled check, trying to explain through their limited communication that something important was about to happen. Whether they fully understood, he couldn't tell. But Syrah held his gaze for a long moment before dipping her head in what he'd come to recognize as acknowledgement. The day of the maintenance check arrived with the station seemingly unaware of the drama about to unfold. Glenn performed his regular duties with mechanical precision, all the while acutely conscious of the countdown ticking away in his mind. When the announcement came over the station-wide communication system that the maintenance check would commence in 30 minutes, Glenn was already positioned near the security wing, ostensibly checking environmental controls in the adjacent sector. As predicted, when the systems went offline for reboot, the electronic locks throughout the station disengaged with audible clicks. Glenn moved quickly, slipping into the security wing and navigating the darkened corridors, lit only by emergency lighting. Chief Ramos's office was empty, as he'd hoped. She would be in the main security hub overseeing the reboot. The drawer containing the override key required a manual key during electronic downtime, a key that would normally be on Ramos's person. But Glenn had prepared for this. From his tool belt, He produced a set of precision picks, tools ostensibly used for delicate wiring work, but equally effective on the simple mechanical locks that served as backups. Years of working with intricate station systems had given Glenn's hands remarkable steadiness and precision. Even so, it took precious minutes to manipulate the lock until it finally surrendered with a soft click. Inside the drawer lay the override key, a small metallic cylinder etched with complex authentication patterns. Glenn pocketed it and carefully relocked the drawer, leaving no evidence of his intrusion. He exited the security wing just as the lights flickered back to life, systems coming online one by one. No alarm sounded, no security personnel appeared to apprehend him. The first, and perhaps most dangerous part of his plan had succeeded. Now came the true test. Glenn made his way to Sector 17B, moving with purpose, but not hurry. Just another systems inspector making his rounds. His heart pounded so loudly in his ears, he was certain anyone passing would hear it. But the few staff members he encountered barely glanced his way. At the bulkhead separating the active sectors from the abandoned ones, Glenn paused. Once he crossed this threshold with the intent of freeing prisoners, there would be no turning back. Everything he had worked for, his entire life on the station, would be forfeit. The image of Leary's face lit with wonder at the simple gift of a growing plant flashed through his mind. Of Syrah, wasting away in a cage, yet still finding the strength to protect and nurture her child. Glenn pressed his palm against the scanner and stepped through as the bulkhead groaned open. The familiar chill of Sector 17B enveloped him as he made his way through ice-rimmed corridors toward the hidden chamber. He moved with greater urgency now, aware that the system reboot might have triggered additional security protocols in this supposedly abandoned sector. When he reached the makeshift barrier with its gap just wide enough to slip through, Glenn hesitated. The surveillance camera above the entrance was still blinking its steady red light. He'd planned to disable it temporarily, as he had during his visits. But now he wondered if that would only draw attention. The maintenance check might have reset the surveillance logs, and any tampering would be immediately noticeable. No, better to move quickly and decisively. The override key would leave no electronic trace of the cage being opened, but nothing could hide the physical absence of the prisoners once they were gone. Glenn squeezed through the gap and entered the chamber, his eyes immediately seeking out the cage and its occupants. Syrah and Leary were huddled together as usual, but Glenn could tell immediately that something was different. They were alert, tense, as if they had been waiting. The small plant he had brought them had grown, its delicate green shoot stretching upward from the nutrient gel, reaching for non-existent sunlight. Glenn moved quickly to the cage, pulling the override key from his pocket. "It's time," he said, knowing they couldn't understand his words, but hoping his intent was clear. "We're leaving." He inserted the key into the lock mechanism, holding his breath as the authentication patterns on the cylinder aligned with the corresponding patterns in the lock. For a moment, nothing happened, and Glenn's heart sank. Had he taken the wrong key? Had the system reboot changed the authentication protocols? Then, with a soft hiss, the lock disengaged. The cage door slid open for the first time in over a year. Syrah stood frozen, her four eyes wide with disbelief. Leary pressed against her mother's side, her silver scales reflecting the dim light in shimmering patterns. Glenn gestured urgently. "Come, quickly!" Syrah hesitated only a moment longer before gathering Leary into her arms and stepping through the open doorway. Her movements were stiff, uncertain, as if she'd forgotten how to walk freely. Once outside the cage, she seemed to grow taller, her crest lifting slightly from its flattened position against her skull. She looked directly at Glenn, and her eyes held a depth of emotion that transcended their communication barriers. But there was no time for reflection. Glenn guided them toward the exit, his every sense alert for signs of discovery. They had to reach the maintenance tunnel and make their way to the evacuation pod bay before the next security sweep, which would happen in less than 30 minutes. As they slipped through the gap in the barrier and into the corridor beyond, a piercing alarm suddenly cut through the silence of the abandoned sector. Glenn froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. Had they triggered some hidden sensor? Had someone discovered the missing override key already? But the alarm wasn't security-specific. It was station-wide. And a moment later, the overhead speakers crackled to life. "Attention all personnel. Meteor storm approaching on Vector 227 Mark 45. Impact imminent. All personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Glenn felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Fear at the genuine danger a meteor storm represented, but also a wild hope. The chaos of an emergency response might provide the perfect cover for their escape. "Come on," he urged, taking Sierra's free hand and pulling her into a run. Leary clung to her mother, eyes wide with alarm at the blaring sirens. They raced through the abandoned corridors, Glenn leading them through a labyrinth of service passages that hadn't seen human traffic in years. Twice, they had to backtrack when they encountered collapsed sections or doors, frozen shut with ice. All around them, the station groaned and shuddered as the first impacts of the meteor storm struck the outer hull. Most would be deflected by the station's remaining defensive shields, but some would inevitably break through, causing damage that would require immediate attention from all available personnel. Finally, they reached the maintenance tunnel that would lead them directly to the evacuation pod bay. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for Sierra to navigate while carrying Leary, and it sloped steeply downward, following the curve of the station's inner hull. "Careful," Glenn warned, taking the lead. The metal rungs set into the floor provided traction, but they were slick with condensation, treacherous underfoot. They had descended perhaps halfway when a particularly violent impact shook the station, sending tremors through the tunnel structure. Glenn lost his footing, sliding several meters before managing to catch himself on a protruding pipe. Behind him, he heard Sierra's muffled cry as she too struggled to maintain her balance. When the shaking subsided, Glenn looked back to check on his companions. Sierra had braced herself against the tunnel wall. Leary clutched tightly to her chest. Both appeared unharmed, though visibly shaken. "Not much further," Glenn encouraged, gesturing for them to continue. After what seemed an eternity of careful descent, they reached the bottom of the tunnel, where it opened into a small maintenance hub. From here, access panels led to various parts of the lower station, including the evacuation pod bay. Glenn oriented himself quickly, identifying the correct panel. He pried it open, revealing a short crawl space beyond. "Through here," he directed, helping Sierra navigate the tight space with Leary. The evacuation pod bay was deserted when they emerged, all personnel having reported to their emergency stations elsewhere on the station. 6 pods remained in their docking clamps, spherical vessels designed to sustain life for up to 2 weeks while broadcasting automated distress signals. Glenn moved to the nearest pod, activating the external control panel. The hatch slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a cramped interior with acceleration couches and basic survival equipment. "Get in," he urged, helping Sierra climb into the pod. She settled Leary into one of the smaller couches, securing the safety harness around the child's slender form. Glenn handed over the emergency supplies he'd prepared: ration packs, water, medical supplies, and the falsified documentation that might help them once they reached civilization. "New Aura port," he said, pointing to the navigation console where he'd pre-programmed coordinates. "My friend Nin, florist." He mimed arranging flowers, then pointed to the console again. "Tell Nin, Glenn sent you." Sierra studied his face, her 4 eyes blinking in rapid succession, a sign of intense emotion among her people. Slowly, deliberately, she tapped out the SOS pattern they had shared, then laid her hand over her heart. Glenn understood. "Thank you." Help. Heart. The sentiment transcended their language barrier. He tapped back. The same pattern. The same meaning. Then he reached for the hatch control, preparing to seal them inside. A sudden noise from the bay entrance made him whirl around. Security drones, 3 of them. Their sensors sweeping the area in systematic patterns. They hadn't been detected yet, but it was only moments before the drones would identify unauthorized presence in the evacuation bay. Glenn made a split-second decision. He stepped back from the pod, sealing the hatch from the outside. "Go," he said, even though Sira couldn't hear him through the reinforced hull. He activated the launch sequence, overriding the safety protocols that would normally prevent deployment during an active meteor storm. The pod's engines hummed to life as the docking clamps released their hold. Through the small viewport, Glenn caught one last glimpse of Sira's face, her expression a mixture of gratitude and alarm as she realized he wasn't joining them. Then, the pod dropped away from the station, its thrusters firing to propel it clear of the immediate danger zone before the main engines would engage to carry it toward New Ara port. Glenn turned to face the approaching security drones, his hands raised in surrender. They would arrest him, interrogate him, uncover every detail of what he had done. He would lose everything, his position, his freedom, perhaps even his life. But Sira and Leary would be free. That knowledge filled him with a sense of peace that overshadowed his fear. The drones surrounded him, their mechanical voices demanding identification and explanation for his unauthorized presence. Glenn said nothing, watching through the bay's viewport as the evacuation pod dwindled to a point of light among the stars, carrying its precious cargo toward safety. Whatever came next, he was ready. The interrogation lasted 3 days. Glenn sat in the sterile white room, facing a succession of increasingly senior security officers. They demanded answers about the missing aliens, about the stolen override key, about his motivations. He told them everything. There seemed little point in denial when the surveillance footage from Sector 17B clearly showed him opening the cage. When Chief Ramos's override key had been found in his possession, when the evacuation pod's launch records bore his authentication code. What surprised him was their reaction. Not outrage at his actions, but confusion over the existence of the prisoners in the first place. The higher-ranking officers exchanged troubled glances when Glenn described the cage, the surveillance, the deliberate erasure from station records. It became increasingly clear that the void-born prisoners had not been an official station matter at all, but something far more insidious. Private captives held by someone with enough authority to create blind spots in the system, to redirect resources, to maintain a secret prison in an abandoned sector. On the 4th day, Glenn was visited by a woman he had never seen before. She wore no uniform, no identification, but the security personnel deferred to her with a deference that spoke volumes. "Mr. Mallory," she said, taking a seat across from him. "You've created quite a problem." Glenn said nothing, waiting. "The aliens you released were not official prisoners," she continued. "They were part of a private research project conducted by certain individuals who have since been removed from their positions." "Research," Glenn repeated, not bothering to hide his disgust. "They were starving in a cage." The woman's expression remained neutral. "Their treatment was not authorized or condoned by station administration or Earth Central. In fact, we've been investigating anomalous resource allocations to Sector 17B for some time, though we had not discovered the exact nature of the situation." She slid a datapad across the table. "Your actions, while technically criminal, have inadvertently assisted our investigation. The individuals responsible for imprisoning the Voidborn have been identified and will face appropriate consequences." Glenn glanced at the datapad. It contained transfer orders, reassigning him to New Ara port, effective immediately. "Why?" he asked, suspicious. "The official story is that you're being disciplined with a transfer to a less desirable posting," the woman explained. "The reality is that we need someone at New Ara who can identify the Voidborn if they successfully arrived. Someone they might trust. And if I refuse? Then you'll face the full consequences of your actions. Theft, sabotage, unauthorized release of non-human entities. The charges would result in approximately 20 years in a rehabilitation center. It wasn't really a choice. And besides, New Ara was where he had sent Sira and Lyri, where his friend Nin might have sheltered them. If they had survived the journey. If they had found her. If 1,000 other factors had aligned in their favor. "When do I leave?" Glenn asked.
"Immediately. A transport is waiting."
New Ara Port hung in orbit around a terraformed moon, its sprawling structure a stark contrast to the sterile efficiency of Shard's Edge, where the station had been all clean lines and minimalist design. New Ara was a chaotic amalgamation of different architectural styles, reflecting its history as a waypoint for dozens of species. Glenn's new quarters were small, but private, located in a residential section predominantly occupied by maintenance personnel. His new role was essentially identical to his previous one: systems inspection and maintenance, though with significantly less autonomy and more direct supervision. It was, as the unnamed woman had suggested, a visible demotion. His new colleagues treated him with the wary respect accorded to someone who had fallen from grace, but still retained enough standing to avoid complete disgrace. None of that mattered to Glenn. From the moment he arrived, his thoughts were consumed with finding Sira and Lyri. Nin's flower shop was located in the commercial district, a small but vibrant establishment specializing in rare botanical specimens from across the galaxy. Glenn had known Nin for years. They had served together on an earlier posting before their careers had taken different paths. She was trustworthy, discreet, and most importantly, sympathetic to non-humans in difficulty. When he finally managed to visit her shop, 3 days after his arrival, Glenn found it packed with customers, admiring displays of exotic blooms. Nin herself was busy with a client, her hands moving deftly as she arranged iridescent flowers in a complex pattern. She spotted him immediately, her eyes widening in recognition, but gave no other indication of surprise. When the customer had gone, she gestured for him to follow her into the back room. "Glenn Mallory," she said, once they were alone, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "I heard you'd been reassigned here, but I didn't expect to see you so soon." "I need to know if they made it," Glenn said without preamble. "A Voidborn woman and her child. I sent them to you." Nin's expression gave nothing away. "That's quite a greeting after 3 years. No, how have you been, or lovely shop you have here?" "Please, Nin, it's important." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You always were terrible at subtlety." She moved to a door at the back of the room, securing it with multiple locks before opening it to reveal a narrow staircase. "This way." The staircase led to a small apartment above the shop, Nin's private residence, judging by the eclectic decor and the profusion of plants occupying every available surface. But it was what waited in the small sunroom off the main living area that caught and held Glenn's attention. Sira stood by the window, her slender form silhouetted against the light streaming in from the port's artificial day cycle. Beside her, Lyri knelt on a cushion, intently focused on what appeared to be a drawing tablet. They both looked up at Glenn's entrance. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, Lyri let out a melodic cry of recognition, her silver scales catching the light as she bounded across the room. She stopped just short of touching Glenn, her crest feathers vibrating with excitement as she tapped out the familiar SOS pattern against her own chest. Sira approached more slowly, her luminous eyes never leaving Glenn's face. She looked healthier than he remembered. Her scales had regained their luster, her movements more fluid and graceful without the constraints of the cage. "You survived," Glenn said, his voice thick with emotion. To his astonishment, Sira responded in halting but understandable standard. "Yes, we survived, because of you."
You can speak our language now.
Nin has been teaching me, Sira explained. I was a voice keeper among my people. Languages were my calling. Nin stepped forward. They arrived a week ago in the evacuation pod, half-starved and terrified. The pod's navigation had been damaged during the journey. They were lucky to reach New Ara at all. When they mentioned your name, I knew I had to help. Thank you, Glenn said, looking from Nin to Sira and Lyri. Both of you must have questions. Many, Sira acknowledged. But first, we have something to show you. She gestured to Lyri, who eagerly retrieved her drawing tablet. The child presented it to Glenn with obvious pride. On the screen was a surprisingly sophisticated drawing of 3 figures standing together beneath a stylized sun. One was clearly Sira, another Lyri. The third was undoubtedly meant to be Glenn. Family, Lyri said, the word carefully pronounced. We are family now. Glenn looked at Sira, who nodded slowly. You heard her crying, Sira said simply. When no one else would listen, that makes you family among my people. Something tight and painful that had been lodged in Glenn's chest for years, since the refugees, perhaps even before, loosened at her words. He knelt to be at eye level with Lyri. I'm honored, he said, gently tapping out their shared signal on the drawing tablet. But I don't know what happens next. I've been reassigned here, but I'm being watched. It might not be safe for you to be associated with me. We have discussed this, Nin interjected. I have contacts. People who help non-humans find safe haven away from central authority. There's a colony on Sparrow, a frontier moon. They could go there, start new lives under new identities. Glenn nodded slowly. It made sense. Sparrow was beyond Earth jurisdiction, a place where species from across the galaxy had established a precarious but free existence. Sira and Lyri would be safe there, anonymous, able to build new lives without fear of those who had imprisoned them. When would they leave? He asked. That's the question, isn't it? Nin said, looking meaningfully between Glenn and the Voidborn. When would they leave? Or perhaps, when would you all leave? Glenn stared at her, uncomprehending for a moment. Me? Go with them? Why did they send you here, Glenn? Nin asked. To this specific port, at this specific time. They're watching you because they're watching for them. You're the bait in their trap. The realization hit Glenn with the force of a physical blow. Of course. The unnamed woman, the convenient transfer, the visible demotion that still left him with freedom of movement around the port. They were using him to find Sira and Lyri. I've put you all in danger just by coming here, he said, rising to his feet. I should go. Stay away. No, Sira interrupted, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it. No more cages. No more separation. She placed a hand on Lyri's shoulder. We survived because you risked everything. Now we stay together. The transport to Sparrow leaves in 3 days, Nin said. I can arrange passage for all 3 of you. False documentation, new identities. You'd have to leave everything behind. Glenn, your career, your connections to Earth Central, everything. Glenn looked at Sira and Lyri. These 2 beings who had endured unimaginable hardship, yet still found the capacity for trust, for hope, for the concept of family. What was he really leaving behind? A career built on following protocols that had failed the vulnerable. Connections to a system that had imprisoned innocence and looked away? 3 days, he repeated. We'll be ready. The dawn on Sparrow painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the small homestead Glenn had helped build on the outskirts of the frontier settlement known as New Haven. It wasn't much. A main dwelling constructed from local timber and salvaged station components. A small garden where Lyri enthusiastically tended both Earth and Voidborn plants. And a workshop where Glenn repaired the community's tech in exchange for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. 4 months had passed since their arrival on the frontier moon. 4 months of hard work, of learning to live together, of building something new from the ashes of their former lives. Glenn sat on the porch, watching the twin moons of Sparrow sink below the horizon as the sun rose. The air was crisp with morning dew, carrying the sweet scent of the native flowering vines that had overtaken one side of the house. The door opened behind him, and Sarah emerged with 2 steaming cups. She handed one to Glenn before settling beside him on the rough-hewn bench. Her movements had a fluid grace that still captivated him, even after months of daily proximity. "Leary is still sleeping," she said, her standard now nearly perfect, with only the faintest musical lilt to betray her non-human origins. "She was up late with her star maps." Glenn smiled. Leary had developed an intense fascination with astronomy, spending hours charting the unfamiliar constellations visible from Sparrow. "She's going to be a navigator someday. Or an explorer." "Not a systems inspector?" Sirah teased gently. "The universe has enough of those." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the landscape come alive with the rising sun. In the distance, the settlement's communal fields were already busy with workers preparing for the coming harvest season. "I received a message from Nin yesterday," Sirah said after a while. "The investigation has officially been closed. The humans responsible for our captivity have been sentenced." Glenn nodded, feeling a complex mixture of emotions at the news. Justice had been served, in a way, but it did little to erase the trauma Sirah and Leary had endured. "Did she mention anything about us? Are they still looking?" "No. We are presumed lost. The evacuation pod registered as destroyed in a meteor collision near the Cygnus boundary. We are ghosts now." "Does that bother you?" Glenn asked. "Being officially dead?" Sirah considered the question, her 4 eyes reflecting the sunrise in shimmering patterns. "My people have a concept called renewal through erasure. When one life ends, it creates space for another to begin." She gestured to the homestead around them. "This is our renewal." From inside the house came the sound of movement, Leary awakening, no doubt already eager to begin her day of exploration and discovery. "We should tell her about the message," Glenn said, rising from the bench. "She'll want to know she's truly safe now." Sirah caught his hand as he turned toward the door. "She has always been safe," she said softly. "From the moment you heard her crying." Glenn felt his throat tighten with emotion. He thought of the frozen cage, of the trembling sound that had led him through the darkness, of the child who had tapped out patterns against metal bars. "We all were," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. Inside, Leary had already set the table for breakfast, her silver scales gleaming in the morning light that streamed through the windows. The walls of the main room were covered in her artwork, vibrant depictions of their life on Sparrow, interspersed with more abstract representations of stars and planets. One drawing held the place of honor above the hearth, the same image she had shown Glenn that day in Nin's apartment. 3 figures standing together beneath the sun. Family. As Glenn and Sirah entered, Leary looked up with a bright smile, her crest feathers rising in greeting. She tapped out their special pattern, no longer a distress signal, but a symbol of connection, of trust, of love transcending species and language and the vast, cold spaces between stars. Glenn tapped back, the gesture as natural to him now as breathing. In this small home on a frontier moon, far from the bureaucratic machinery that had nearly destroyed them all, they had found something precious and rare. They had found each other. They had found home. And somewhere in the darkness of space, a child had cried, and one human had heard, and that had made all the difference.